Okay, I think we will get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today and welcome to our second Science and Society Bite. My name is Jack Monaghan. I'm part of the science engagement team here within Wellcome Connecting Science. And this Science and Society Bites series is a partnership between Wellcome Connecting Science and the Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science and the Public in Cambridge. Each session, we reflect on a big question within engagement, research and dialogue with a guest or guests that have exciting ideas to share. And of course, this session is no exception. Our guest today is Clio Heslop. Clio is Head of Policy Partnership and Impact at the British Science Association. And my strongest connection to Clio's work is through a report last year that she commissioned titled Science Engagement Mapping. The report took a deeply statistical look at the opportunities for engagement within science across different regions of the UK, and we'll hear lots more about that shortly. But Clio also has lots of other fascinating projects that I'm sure people on the call will be interested in. These include the BSA's connection with the Science Wise Consortium, which brings dialogue and the public together to inform policy. Clio is also involved in the Future Forum that brings youth voices into policy making around science and supports the all-party parliamentary group on diversity and inclusion in STEM, amongst many other projects. So there's lots there for us to dig into. And I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Tuba to host this session and to navigate us through some of those fascinating projects. Tuba joined our team here at Wellcome Connecting Science and at the Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science and the Public as a senior qualitative social scientist doing some fascinating work in science engagement and lots of exciting things to come from Tuba on that. I'm going to hand over here to Tuba to get us started on this conversation with Clio, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion and getting some questions from you in the audience as well. So over to you, Tuba.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack. So let me again thank you all, for being here and spending your bite in the lunch with us, hearing really fascinating stories. So welcome again, Clio. So I'm sure that we have a lot to learn as well as discuss with you. So I think we're pretty lucky in a sense that the audience you have today is very much passionate about what you've been doing because we are in the same path. So before we go in depth about the report, I wonder if you can start with giving a little bit a bit more information about BSA and overall work. And of course, I would say that it is also very interesting for us to learn how you yourself, end up in where you are now, because what you do is not only about the scientific work, it has a lot of commitment to community engagement too.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, thank you all so much for having me here. Thank you to Jack and Richard for inviting me and you for hosting. Really excited to be here. So yes, I'm Clio. I'm Head of Policy Partnerships and Impact at British Science Association. Now, British Science Association, we are a national science education and engagement charity that was founded in 1831. So we've been around quite a long time. And our kind of founding principles were to improve what was termed at the time kind of lay people's access to science. So there were already organisations that existed like the Royal Society or the Royal Institution, where people could go and hear about the latest scientific developments of the day, but they were very much London-based and tended to involve, a quite learned, quite elite group of people. The BSA was set up to be a kind of, to bring science out to those who maybe were further out of the country or didn't have that science background. And so we've maintained some of that throughout our history, really. And we run a number of different programs and activities. So we have an education team that works very closely with schools and young people, and particularly creating opportunities for young people to lead their own science projects and do project-based learning through a scheme called the Crest Awards. We run the annual British Science Festival, which is taking place in Exeter this year, but moves to a different UK city and university host each year. And we coordinate a network of other science festivals across the UK. We do a lot of community and grassroots activity, mostly through grant making, so awarding small grants to small organisations that might not previously have worked with science or research or have much of a connection to it. And then, as you mentioned in the introduction to me, we have a quite small but quite focused policy team where we're really thinking about diversity and inclusion, public voice on science and technology, and then a little bit about things that align to our programmes like community voice and education. And I've been with the BSA about 6.5 years. I joined from academic publishing and previously to that in university policy. So I've kind of seen all sides of science communication on the university side, on the corporate, and now very much on the kind of third sector side of things. So yeah, just a bit of background there.
Oh yeah, amazing. I think we all acknowledge how challenging it might be aiming to bring in public voices in policy, I think. So today we're going to talk mostly about the engagement mapping report, and I do believe that you have some slides for that to share with us.
Yeah, so shall I kick off with those slides? I can tell you a bit
I mean,
about...
as you like, like. So
great. Okay.
I think following your, I mean, do you prefer us to have, if the audience have questions, do you want them to interrupt at the moment, or do you prefer that everyone waits till the end and then we can continue with the questions?
I'm very happy to take questions as we go. I'm not sure we'll probably be able to see the chat while I'm screen sharing, so honestly, just come.
Okay, so then let's keep the questions. I mean, I will try to also reflect the ones on the chat box, but like audience is very much welcome to unmute and like raise their questions after the presentation. So thanks a lot, Clio. The floor is yours.
Let's go. Okay, so hopefully you can see those slides. Great. So yeah, as I say, just a little future where science is more relevant, representative, and connected to society. So all of our programs contribute to that, or in one way or another. So starting to talk about how we work with people and communities and people's connection to science. This started our kind of research in this area. We've been involved in lots of different programs that explore connections between science and society for a long time. You mentioned ScienceWise, which is a government-backed dialogue project. We've been involved in that for a long time. Things like Public Attitudes to Science, which is a government survey, or I know the Wellcome Trust have also done various public surveys of how people interact with science. The BSA has always had a bit of a voice or a bit of a role in planning those. But in 2015, we started to commission our own polling. So we would commission research on a representative sample of the UK population to understand their personal science identity, their connection to science. And we used it to create this audience map. So we'd have people that had a professional association with science, they did a science job or studied science. And so a really strong science identity that comes from that. We'd have people that were engaged with science and sort it out in their day-to-day lives. And then we'd have these groups that would say they weren't interested, or they kind of came across science now and then, but wouldn't make a special effort to. And we sorted the UK population through these surveys, and we found that about 10% were in this professionals group, around 15% in the engaged group, and around 50% in the middle in this inactive, and 25% or so again and they're not interested. So about 75% of the population were in this either inactive or not really interested or engaged with science. And the other thing that we found from doing this work was there were some really strong demographic trends. So the people that were engaged, or professionals that, you know, were coming along to science events and talks and activities and things like that, or hosting them themselves, tended to have general societal privilege, were more likely to be male and to have a high level of education, a higher income. And so we could really see that there was a piece of work that needed to be done around diversity and inclusion in science. And that was really, really transformative to us. And we started using this model a lot to help us think through strategically who we wanted to be working with and why. And we'd also thought about using the model as a bit of an evaluation tool to see how well our activities were working at making people feel more engaged. But we stepped away from that and decided, actually, with our community-based programs, we really felt like we needed just to work with people where they were rather than try to change them or shift them. And as I say, we were noticing these demographic patterns. But after kind of 3 or so years of trying to use this tool in different ways, we just reached the end of its usefulness, I guess. With a 2,000 person national survey, you just don't actually get much detail about where engagement is happening, or why, or who's involved, or who has more opportunities or who doesn't. And so we've been thinking for a really long time about what we could do that would supplement this survey work. And survey work's really expensive. So the obvious answer is do a bigger survey, but, you know, we'd be adding at least another 0 to the budget that we'd spent on the one previously, and we just didn't. We just didn't have the money to do it. So we thought, well, we started to think, what could we do? And at the same time, my colleagues in the community engagement teams were working in a much, much more localized way, giving out grants and supporting groups that were working very directly with the communities around them. So we have a number of programs that are these very kind of, very place-based and very tailored towards particular groups. And the BSA really, you know, we provide a platform for this work to happen, but we don't get involved very much in the content or delivery. I can talk a bit about that at the end if there are questions, particularly about how we run some of these schemes. So we felt like there was this kind of evidence gap where our work was getting more community embedded, but the evidence and the tools that we were using were still really big picture, really top line. And we're really interested in how and why people might encounter science in their local areas, so that we could think a bit more carefully about, when we're looking at community-based initiatives, where we put our resources or what context they might be happening in. And from a policy point of view, it was right at the beginning of the government talking about the levelling up agenda and R&D funding and where science research and business was happening. And I really was thinking, how can we get science engagement into that conversation? It's often gets sidelined a bit as a policy issue, but from my team's work, I just thought, okay, is there an opportunity to have a bit more conversation about different types of access to science, and also to remind people that work in engagement that there's this whole other science ecosystem that we're part of. So it's very much a kind of experiment, really, a bit of a pilot project to try to start mapping all of these things together. And there were a few other things that I really wanted that were important for us, given that, yes, this is a pilot piece of work. We wanted, as I say, to try and get that broad picture, lots of different ways to encounter science. So you might know someone that works in a nuclear power facility, for example, or if you have a big bit of infrastructure like that in your local community, that can create quite a powerful connection to science. But also it might be through a festival or more informal, or it might be through a university. So we wanted to try and layer all these things up and see what it looked like nationally. People that I know that work in science engagement have been talking for years about, can we pool all of our visitor data or all of our all the people we engage with and create a kind of hotspot map. And the conversations never really go anywhere because people are worried about sharing that data, quite rightly in some cases, or it presents a sense of competition. So what we did instead, we were like, let's just focus on the fixed things, the infrastructure, rather than the people that are engaging with them in this first instance. And as I say, we just wanted something that we could do that was detailed, because we were really missing detail from our surveys and that kind of thing. So what I did is I worked with an economics agency called London Economics, and worked with them to think about what data is there that exists about things like the location of science businesses and jobs, the research and development that's happening within universities, the places where there's a lot of people with STEM qualifications, trying to, which of these data sets could we use to kind of present a national picture of science engagement opportunities? And they gave a few pointers just from very much from the data point of view. So they were saying, okay, we can only include data that is complete, that we can compare across all UK nations and regions, that is relatively contemporary and consistent, and that if we wanted to repeat this exercise in 5 years, we might be able to see some changes, and that there was enough variation in the data. We weren't just going to end up with a kind of solid grey map of everyone gets the same. So those were some of the considerations that went into deciding what went into this index that we ended up creating. And so we split the index actually into 4 categories. Education, so the level of highly qualified graduate qualifications in a particular area, the STEM industry and business, so jobs and businesses that were located in the area, higher education funding, that was the institutions one, and where there are lots of STEM students. And then finally, this cultural piece. So science centres, a little bit about where the BSA, we put some of our grant data into there, but we weighted that at quite a low level because these are quite, as I said, quite kind of small scale activities. And then things like STEM ambassadors and science festivals and museums. So by no means exhaustive in terms of the different science engagement activities that were out there, but a kind of starting point to see what it would look like if we put all this data together. And then we, the team at London Economics did very much that. They looked at all of those, each of those 4 areas, and created individual maps for those, and then an overall thing of them all combined. And the first thing to notice is that actually, especially these education, industry and engagement maps, they all look quite different from each other. So you can see in the education one, there's real concentrations around cities and urban areas, and then a lot in the southeast of very STEM, people with high level of qualifications in STEM. And that doesn't necessarily align to where there's a lot of STEM jobs. So the industry one looks a little bit different, and places where there's a lot of STEM industry aren't necessarily places where there's lots of highly qualified people, or, as it seems, lots of universities or those cultural activities either. So looking at those cultural activities and the university activities together, these maps look a little bit more similar. So even without counting things like the public engagement that happens directly within universities, we didn't have a huge amount of data on that. But even just thinking where there's science festivals and events, they do tend to cluster around universities. So these 2 maps look quite similar. And then when you put all 4 things together into one map, you see a really, really complex landscape. So there's areas where there's just a real concentration of activity. Actually, South Cambridge is one of them, where there are science festivals and events, there are STEM businesses, there's a university, and there's a lot of very highly qualified people. But that actually, the range of influence of that seems to be fairly short. So, you can travel 20, 30 miles and the picture looks quite different. There's, it's not like there are STEM jobs within a huge 50-mile radius, and it all seems to drop off fairly quickly and be quite localized. And we see that in a few places, like I mentioned, Cambridgeshire, but Bristol's another example where, areas directly next to it look like there are way fewer opportunities. So yeah, as I say, we see these kind of clusters around universities and large cities, but not everywhere. So, there's no dedicated science festival or science museum, science centre in Liverpool or Leeds, which we found quite interesting. And I'm not from those areas myself, but friends tell me that those people that live in Liverpool and Leeds are unlikely to be going into Manchester or Sheffield or Bradford, or where there are other opportunities. And again, it's kind of lower provision in coastal and rural areas, which you might expect, although there are some exceptions. But in commuter areas as well. So there's a kind of ring around London where not much seems to be happening in terms of science engagement opportunities. There's a real assumption that people travel into the city. The transport links are really good. So why wouldn't you be coming into one of the universities or one of the science centres, or there's not too much happening in the outer areas that we could see through this data, of course. So there's lots of kind of interesting little details within the map. We do have an interactive version on the BSA website, which I can share. If you want to delve a little bit deeper into where those kinds of hot and cold spots are. But it's important to say, as I mentioned, this was really a bit of an experiment, a bit of a pilot project for us. So we're not showing by any means all opportunities for doing science engagement. If, we'd love to, as a follow-on piece of work, expand that cultural bit in particular. To just add more and more data in to see where activities are tending to be happening. And as I mentioned, we didn't put in data about who is engaging. It shows where there are more opportunities to engage at the moment. But we don't know who is going there, to what extent they're traveling beyond the kind of boundaries of those local authority regions that I showed you on the map. We unfortunately just couldn't code in the travel time thing as well, and transport links. And of course, just because an engagement opportunity exists, it doesn't necessarily mean it's really, really good. It's just showing us what is there. But it does open up a lot of really, really interesting questions. So about, if you did align things, if you did overlay another map that had things like level of deprivation or transport connectivity or something like that, would it look different? Would it basically just show the same thing about where there are lots of opportunities? Also, in the areas where there's a lot of STEM infrastructure, there's a large business or a lot of people with STEM qualifications. It's interesting to see whether we're actually making the most of creating science engagement opportunities around that. As I say, that industry map looked quite different to the engagement map. So there might be opportunities to straight away start doing a little bit more in terms of business partnerships. Digital engagement, and other things that are just a bit less mappable. I'm not sure how you would show that as a kind of national geographic picture. I think that's something to keep thinking about. And then there's a load of questions about the kind of impact and the so what, and trying to understand a little bit more clearly what's happening on the ground in some of these areas. I mentioned that the British Science Festival is going to be in Exeter in September, and the area around Exeter and Devon, Somerset is quite an interesting one on the map. So it'd be really good when we're there to talk to some people about whether they feel like the picture on the map is representative of how they're working in the area. So as a kind of, what we're planning to do next, I'm hoping over the next few months to be working a lot more with our community engagement teams to understand, again, whether we've got a huge amount of evaluation work on the impact of their activities on the people that they're working with. And what I'd really like to do is start to connect that into this national picture. And also the British Science Association, we work on a 3-year business planning schedule. It's really coming up to the point where we're going to be thinking about what we want to do over our next 3-year period. And I think this data is going to be really helpful for us because as I say, we're working in more and more local ways. But also I'd quite like to make it a little bit more practical. So for people like yourselves that are interested in putting together science engagement activities, how might you want to use this? How can we kind of create some more user guides or these deep dives into some local areas? What extra data might be helpful so that we can think about where to take it next? I've spoken to a few different organisations that want to use it in different ways, a few funding organisations as well that want to use it to help think about where they direct their resource. But yeah, I'm just always keen to hear more and keen to hear more responses. So I'll pause there. I can always go back to slides because I know that I ran through quite quickly on some of them. But I'll pause there, Tuba, if you've got any questions or anyone. And as I say, we can go back as needed.
Thanks a lot, Clio. Inspirational and amazing work. So I myself also have several questions, but we already have one in our Q&A. Jorge has a question. I mean, Jorge, if you want, you can ask the question yourself, or I can read for it. So, okay, I think he yes, please. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Cool. Thank you. So thank you, Clio, for the great presentation. I have a question related to the work we do on the Genome Campus quite readily, related to science for public health and medicine. What are the major factors for communicating with populations as diverse as we find in the UK? And in particular, with the benefits or lack thereof of genomic science for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Major factors. I think it's very hard with it's very hard to work from surveys and opinion and that kind of thing. We just haven't really asked the public enough what they think and feel about health technologies and genomics in that way. However, the colleagues that I work with on ScienceWise, which is a public dialogue program, they've done actually really a lot of work on public attitudes and public values. And I think there are some trends that you see, and it applies actually on a lot of different emerging technologies, not just health technologies and not just genomics, but there are some kind of questions that come up over and over again. And I think thinking about how you respond to some of those questions as a starting point can be really useful. So a lot of it is about fairness and access and how we make sure that everyone benefits. And another thing is about safety and people wanting to know that that things are safe and well tested and well well evidenced, and then things about governance. So I think there's this kind of baseline of questions that maybe you have to get over first, and make sure that you're able to answer those. And then in terms of, I think it's a lot of listening and responding to people. I think it's very hard to do a kind of one size fits all type of communication in some ways. But like I say, I think I'm tying myself in knots now. I hope that's a little bit helpful. I'm going to share some of the ScienceWise work because I think it's really, really useful. And I think thinking about things like trusted messages and working with community leaders, my colleagues do quite a lot of work on that, and finding one or two people that you can work with to understand, what their community might want to know about a particular area.
Excellent. Thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Clio. So, I mean, but as you said, the overall research led to more and better questions. So I think we will raise a bit more then. So there is one other question from Irena. I don't know if she prefers to ask the question herself. Or maybe I can only raise because it was a question that we also had on our list. So she asks about the most surprising or unexpected results from the report, particularly that you can talk of.
Surprising or unexpected. I think that the level of complexity, like I really didn't expect it to be so up and down across the UK. I expected that you would you'd see the effects of science and research organizations in particular. I thought that there'd be a bit of a wider influence, so you'd see more STEM graduates and STEM jobs in a kind of wider area, I expect. And yeah, just quite how much the engagement aligned with universities when we were, we didn't really include that much university-based data, but still there was quite a big alignment. And yeah, it really challenged me to think about the issue of STEM business, which and industry, and how you do engagement around industry, which I think the engineering community is quite good at, but maybe there are other opportunities.
Thanks a lot. So until we have another question from the audience, let me use this opportunity to raise a couple of ours. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the methodology of the report, because you've already mentioned some limitations that you decided on, but can you tell us a little bit more about two specific things? The first one is, when you were talking about the audience, you said that not interested, inactive, and then you have the engaged. And how would you comment on placing disengaged communities? So are they the inactive ones or not interested ones or both? So how we can talk about, how you consider that? And secondly, about the metrics, because you already said that you might need to dig deeper for instance, for the cultural domain. So how the metrics and the domains are decided, and what type of an approach you adopted for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of that 4-category audience model, I think it depends what you mean by disengaged, because I think for people that, if you start talking about science or a science topic, they say, oh, I'm not interested in that, or haven't heard much about that before, or something like that, then you put them in that not interested or inactive topic. But then there's a group of people that are engaged but negatively, if that makes sense. So people that might have a really negative view of climate science or vaccine science or something like that. And actually, we would tend to put them in the engaged group because we're thinking more about kind of attitude and behavior rather than whether they like science or not. So those people, I think, feel very strongly that they are engaging with the evidence, but you know, they're taking it their own. So you know, I think you'd maybe use more of an approach of someone that you think is very engaged in science and try and create a very much an activity that looks and feels like a science activity to work with those people. Whereas for people that are not interested, a lot of the community engagement work that my colleagues run, on the surface of it doesn't look much like it looks much more like a community fair or a community activity than a science activity, even though there's science and research involved. So I hope that answers that question. And then in terms of the data that went in and how we chose it, was that the other one? So as I say, we wanted something that was national, so where there was some data from each of the 4 home nations of the UK and a reasonable amount of data, so that it wasn't just concentrating all of the information in one region of the map. And then apart from that, it was really about what could we get quickly and from people that we know. So doing freedom of information requests to all the research funders and that kind of thing, we just didn't have the time to do. I think, yeah, there's a lot more data that exists that we just couldn't get our hands on in the timeline. But yeah, we thought we'd make a start with what we could do.
Yeah, I mean, I think every research is in a way restricted with the feasibility and what we can do at the end, you know, like for the optimization. I mean, I was so excited to ask you a question. I think I overlooked Richard's hand. So maybe Richard, you can also raise a question.
That's all right. I think it's yeah. I mean, I think the data thing's really interesting because we talk a lot about, you know, how you get researchers to share data, but also to get kind of institutions and to share data that's quite integral to their activities as well, and to how they get evaluated and stuff is quite a challenge. And it would be great to kind of build a framework for doing that. I mean, I suppose you started to pick up a bit on my question, I think, in what you said before, which was about, you know, that some of the things that you do as engagement, or that your colleagues do as engagement, might not look like kind of science engagement. And so I was interested in, well, my first question was about, you know, how has the kind of approach and the strategies of engagement changed as a result of or being formed by, I suppose, by your kind of classification of audiences and of areas. And then the other question was whether you have any sense of, because the universities thing was really interesting. And I think that, having worked somewhere where there were kind of 2 universities in a city, where one university was very kind of community and area focused, and one university was much more international in its focus. So do you have a sense of what the radius is of different universities' engagement? I suspect it probably can't be picked out of the data, but I kind of maybe more of an impression. Thanks, Leo.
Yeah, so yes, that first question about how our approach to community engagement is, or different types of engagement has changed. It has shifted quite a lot, actually. So I think when we first started doing any kind of community engagement, it was giving out micro grants, so about between £500 and £1,000 to organisations to do an activity in Science Week, and we didn't really mind what it was, but it was sort of about building trust, building a bit of visibility for the British Science Association, like making people aware that this was somewhere that they could come and get some funding to do some activities in their local area. And we were very, very light touch. So it might be that you know, an organisation wanted to hold a bake sale in Science Week, and so maybe, I don't know, put a couple of sciencey pictures on their cakes or something. It was like, you know, we didn't really mind how visible the science was. It was more about permission to get involved. And then year by year, as we, after about 2 or 3 years of handing out those micro grants, you know, we noticed that there were some people that had applied a couple of years running. And so we'd reach out to them and my internet just dropped out for a second. I hope.
Froze for a second on
Okay.
we reached out to them and
yeah, and asked how they would, what their experience had been, what they'd been doing with the grants, and what they might want from us. And from there, my colleague developed a small program called Community Leaders, where 12 people that had applied a couple of times could come and do some workshops together and learn a little bit more about science engagement and what it is. So like the kind of very first training courses that researchers go on about how you communicate science to the public. And we'd start offering those to the community leaders. And then we'd done that for a couple of years. And then we asked them, okay, what next? And they said, oh, we'd really like, you know, we really struggle to know how to contact researchers. Like, how do we get them involved? And so then we started doing a bit more of the work where we're trying to develop collaborations between communities and researchers. So that's the kind of journey that we've gone on from just being very much just trying to introduce ourselves to community groups to then trying to build more kind of connections and collaborations between. And it's always been very much kind of relationship first rather than topic first or science first. Like, we just support these groups to get to know one another. And I can share a couple of reports as follow-up from my colleagues of how they've done that. And then range of influence of different types of universities. This is really interesting and something that we're looking into a little bit for the all-party parliamentary group on diversity and inclusion in STEM, which is a policy group for MPs and Lords, and they commission us to do some reports for them. And there is some quite interesting data, not really about engagement, but about student intake and things like that, and the differences between different kinds of universities. I think in terms of engagement, yeah, I'd like to do more. I'd like to be able to get that differentiation, but we don't really have it at the moment. Yeah, there's a small kind of network, or there's a network called Guild HE that do some quite interesting work, and I keep meaning to get in touch with them and see if they've got anything to help.
Thanks, Clio.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm just checking anyone else. So okay, I see Deepti has a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, hi. It was such an interesting talk that I do public engagement with schools around Cambridge, and recently started international engagement as well with some schools in Australia and Kazakhstan. But the project that I run, I mean, we are facing challenges with funding, although you say that you would help and support, and I would like to know, for the projects which, for instance, the one that I run has been going on for 7 years. It started with one student as a pilot, and now we have around 300 to 400 students each year that I engage with and talk about science, and around protein structures that we have over here, and they create artworks, although their interests might be different, or they want to learn about science in future, but with this project, they kind of get the artistic impression as well as, bring science and art together. So my question really is, how can anyone look at supporting such grants or such projects which have been running for a couple of years, because it is with the present climate, it is quite difficult. You do all kinds of evaluations and you work around a model, but how would you overcome such that we could continue our engagement with the schools?
Yeah, again, that's great. A great question. I think it is hard at the moment. There is funding out there, but I think it sounds like you're doing great work in terms of evaluation, and yeah, I think being able to I think being able to tell a bit of a story about where you want the work to go and how you want the young people to develop as a result can be helpful. I think in terms of places to go for funding, we do give out some grants directly to schools during British Science Week. So Kickstart grants, I believe they are called. And then a lot of the scientific societies have grant schemes that are particularly aimed at engaging with schools and young people on different scientific topics. So I think they might, some of those scientific societies might be good places to start in terms of kind of taking it to the next stage. But yeah, I'll have a think, and if I can come up with any kind of other immediate places where I would go to. And I think as well, I think potentially if you know of other organizations that are running similar programs or programs that could align, thinking about what partnerships you might be able to build with other organizations that might have more access to resource, then that could be another thing. But it is challenging at the moment. I think a couple of big a couple of initiatives that existed for a long time has dropped out over the last few years.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So I just thought I'd hear your views, and it's a bit challenge at the moment. It's challenging how to secure funding for such nice projects which try and bring not only UK students but also international students, and we create a lot of engagement with them. But it's a shame that you cannot go further if you don't have funding. But I will look into the Kickstart grants that you mentioned. And if you have anything else, I would love to hear from you, Clio. So that would be very useful. Thank you.
Just a note to say that I've put the link to the Kickstart grant scheme in the chat for everyone. So you should be able to see that now, and we can send on some follow-on links if Clio passes those on afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dipti. I think we came back to the realities that, like, in addition to the goodwill and the intentions that we want to do, we also need further support and financial resources to be able to realize what we all hope to do. I do not see any other questions so far, so let me get this opportunity to raise another one. Clio, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the impact of these metrics that you had, because this report is, seems to be a very influential one. So I'd like to ask, how did you measure as well? What is the impact within the BSA as well as the out of BSA? Because I think, let me just check, Sam should be here. So we can already give you some examples about how we could make use of it in the buzz map. So maybe, Sam, would you mind talk a little bit about the buzz map, and then we can give the opportunity to Clio to reflect on the question afterwards?
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Yeah. So I guess in context, we're looking at you're using your report, Clio, as a way of noticing that. I think on your map it was West Suffolk was one of those ones, and we've sort of tried to use the map to target how we would approach connecting with communities, and so we're now sort of using your map to connect with local nature reserves in sort of local authorities near to our campus that sort of have been highlighted as not having as higher opportunities to engage with science. So in that regard, it's really helped us to sort of think of other ways of connecting the research that we do on campus with some of these more local communities. I'm really excited to see how that goes, essentially. And I'm sure Jack probably has mentioned a bit more about it as well to you. So that's kind of one way that we're thinking, and we'd be happy to share how that goes moving forward. It's at its early stages, but we're really excited to see what the potential could be.
That's super exciting. Yeah, that's really, really good to hear. Yeah. Impact. So I haven't done a huge amount of formal impact capture other than a little bit on my colleagues kind of tracking downloads and things like that. We were actually, it's surprisingly hard to work out exactly who's using the web page and things like that. However, I've had a lot of conversations with people about how they're starting to use it. And I think internally, as I mentioned, we're coming up to our strategy and business planning phase. And I think that's hopefully when we'll see some of the impact internally, when my colleagues, hopefully across the BSA, will use it to help inform some of their plans and their strategies for the next 3 years. And our board as well to make some of those strategic decisions for the BSA. I'd be really pleased if that happened. But also for individual programs, things like the Science Festival and the network that they run. I think they're starting to use it a little bit more when they are approaching potential partners or potential new locations for science festivals, to be able to use this data to support them. And again, as I mentioned, I've heard of a few people have got in touch, and a large pharmaceutical company that I won't name has been in touch, for example, and saying that they really want to use it to rethink how they do their outreach and what do you call it, CSR activities, for example. In terms of bigger, even more impactful from that, I would eventually like to, as I say, use it as a bit more of a policy tool, a bit of a policy argument for why science engagement is necessary and important and needs resource, as Deepti mentioned in her question. We're a year or so away, plus or minus, from a general election, and I think the BSA are quite keen, my team are quite keen to put this and a few other things, package it up as something that we can send to the political parties ahead of an election, so that the next government, when they're starting to think about science and education, they're aware that all of these kinds of activities need to be thought about in conjunction with that. So I think we're seeing some impact on practice, and then hopefully in the next few years we'll see a bit of impact in terms of policy and other things.
Oh, great. So still so many things to talk about. I think we can really take this for longer hours, but we are almost at the end of our time. So if I see anything, no, I don't see another hand. So let me conclude with a collaboration question to you, because I mean, what you have discussed also based on the reports and other publications, we do see a lot of parallel lines with what we are doing at DIGVAC and Connecting Science, as well as Cowley. It's the students' jury, just science, just good science. So I think there are a lot of collaboration areas, but I have a very concrete question. People here in the seminar today, but also working with us and at Sangha, how can the scientists interact with you, your team and BSA, so that we can proceed further?
Yes. Yeah, well, I think myself or any of my colleagues, depending on what area you're interested in, would always be happy to hear from people. And the most kind of clear and easy, and it comes around every year, opportunity with the British Science Association is getting involved in the festival. We always do an open call for ideas for not just talks, but any kind of activity that's associated with the festival, which runs for a week in September. The other thing, as I mentioned, my colleagues run this community buddies scheme where they're pairing researchers with community groups in different areas around the UK. And again, that's something that we do a call out for every year, potentially twice a year now, actually. So if you're interested in more of that kind of relational approach and really getting to know a community group and how they work, then as I say, there are opportunities there. And I think, signing up for our main BSA newsletter is a good way just to make sure that I can try and get in the habit of sending it to yourself and Jack as well, so you can put it on your internal lists.
Oh, thanks a lot, Clio. For everyone, like if you haven't had the opportunity to read the report or the full report, Jack pasted the link again on the chat box. So So thank you very much, Clio. It was really amazing listening to you. It's really, really great work. And Jack sent another link to the community buddy scheme. So it was lovely hearing you. So we are very excited about what's coming next, because you already described that there is more to be done and for time. And I think it's going to be very influential in the long run too. So thanks a lot for your time. Thanks everyone for spending the lunch break with us. And till our next Science Bite. Have a lovely day.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.